Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In last week's podcast, we began a series which dealt with 4 episodes following David's infamous affair with Bathsheba and his having her husband brutally murdered on the battlefield. Each episode corresponds to David's outburst of rage when Nathan the prophet told him a story about a wealthy man's robbing a poor man. David had demanded that the rich man pay 4-fold what the punishment required. This multiplication by 4 began when Amnon, David's son, raped Tamar, David's daughter, and Amnon's half-sister. When Absalom, David's son and thus half-brother to Amnon and full brother of Tamar, had Amnon killed, that perhaps should be counted as the second installment of the king's insisting on a 4-fold punishment that he thought Nathan's story required. The rape, of course, would be the first occasion. That certainly makes sense, even though what happened next amounts to at least 2 more episodes that should count as multiplying the punishment. Keep in mind that these incidents all involved David's adult children. Also, remember that after Absalom had orchestrated Amnon's assassination, he had to flee Israel. In the narrative time frame, he has stayed away from home for 3 years. In that period, David finally made peace with losing Amnon, but did not quite know how to welcome Absalom back into the family, even though the king wanted to do just that. At this point, Joab, a military officer in David's army, saw that the king wanted his son back and decided to make Absalom's return possible. That's in chapter 14, verse 1 of 2 Samuel. Joab's plan was to get a female sage who lived nearby to go to the king disguised as a person mourning not only the death of her husband, but an awful family circumstance. After her husband's death, she was to say, her family was reduced to her and her 2 sons. Unfortunately, these brothers quarreled, leading one to kill the other. The extended family now wanted the murderous brother be subject to capital punishment. Were that to happen, the widow would be left without any means of support, not to mention besmirching the name of her deceased husband. When David hears what the sage has to say, he intervenes by saying that her family will not be allowed to exact vengeance on the one remaining son. For this, the woman expresses her gratitude to David. That's in verses 4 through 11 of chapter 14. Then, at that very point, the woman drops her deception and challenges David. She pointed out that David's decision in her case amounted to his convicting himself. That's in verse 13. This is because David had made no effort to bring his alienated son back home. The sage goes on to philosophize about the nature of human life and also flatters David for his own discernment. By now, David knows that he has been had. He asks the woman point blank whether Joab had put her up to this stunt. That's in verse 19. The woman admits Joab's involvement, but quickly pivots. She flatters the king a little more by noting that he could see right through her, though manifestly David did not have a clue previously. She continues to provide the reason for Joab's inserting himself into the family dynamic. The sage told David that Joab had enlisted her help in order to, quote, change the course of affairs. Her final word to the king is that he was as wise as an angel in being able to figure out her ruse. Once again, David's being so obtuse belies her continued flattery. Once again, David has been taken in by a concocted story. First, it was Nathan's little parable, and now the deception of a sage. But what the women did worked. David told Joab to arrange to bring Absalom back home. That's in verse 21 of chapter 14. Joab praised David for this turnaround and saw to it that Absalom, in fact, returned. That was the good news. Unfortunately, there was bad news as well. When Absalom got home, David did not want his son in his presence. He demanded that Absalom stay in his own house. Absalom was back in Jerusalem, but not closer to seeing his father, King David. He was no closer than he had been in Geshur. Joab's trick at best yielded a Pyrrhic victory. David and Absalom were both in proximity, but no closer as father and son. This remains a painful relationship. At this point, the narration directs its attention to Absalom. It turns out that the king's son was extraordinarily handsome. His hair seemed to be the feature that attracted the most attention. Apparently, he cut quite the figure. That's in verses 25 and 26 of chapter 14. Only later will we discover that his lavish head of hair would play a role in his eventual demise. We are also informed that Absalom's own family was getting larger during his absence from David. He now had 3 sons and 1 daughter. It comes as no surprise that he named his beautiful daughter Tamar, after the sister whose rape he had avenged by murdering Amnon. That's in verse 27. After 2 years passed, I should say 2 more years, during which Absalom endured his father's stubbornly remaining aloof, he decided to do something about this festering rift. He wanted to enlist Joab's help, apparently figuring that Joab had sway with the king. But Joab did nothing, even after Absalom tried twice to get him to do something. So, Absalom tried a more drastic strategy. Absalom ordered his servants to put on fire Joab's barley fields. This got Joab's attention in a hurry. Joab demanded an explanation for this outrage. That's in verse 31. Absalom pointed out that he came home for no reason, since he had not seen his father once after returning to Jerusalem. What was the difference between being in Geshur or Jerusalem when he had no opportunity to see his father? At long last, Joab spoke to the king about his alienated son. David relented, at least a little, in that Absalom was allowed to see his father, before whom he bowed, and David kissed his son. But neither one spoke to the other. There was no embrace, no apologies, no words of regret, no effort at reconciliation, and certainly no conciliatory meal. Absalom bowed before David. David kissed his son. That was the extent of this ostensive reunion. The strain of this relationship was palpable. Absalom's willingness to set on fire Joab's barley fields has already suggested that he had been desperate. The cool reunion with King David only exacerbated the matter. After 2 years of stewing, Absalom doubles down on his willingness to take drastic measures. It turns out he was capable of doing much more than burning a little grain. What he did next threatened David's very realm. Absalom acquired horses and a chariot, not to mention 50 men to provide muscle. That's in chapter 15, verse 1. He then positioned himself at the city gate, the place where not only commerce but political issues were dealt with. When Israelite citizens came to the gate seeking redress of some sort, Absalom would ask about the tribe to which the person belonged and the city in which the person lived. When he had this information, he would tell the person that that person had a good case, but that the king had been derelict in appointing judges to settle the issue at hand. That's in verse 3. Then Absalom would say that were he king, citizens could count on being treated justly and fairly. Absalom was blatantly undercutting David's political foundation. In time, Absalom convinced many other Israelite citizens that they would be better off were he, rather than his father, be king. Eventually, in the ominous words of the narrator, quote, Absalom stole the hearts of Israel's men, end of quote. That's in verse 6 of chapter 15 of 2 Samuel. Absalom was not only fomenting rebellion, but was putting in place the ingredients of a coup d'etat. This was hardly the outcome King David would have expected from his continuing coolness toward his estranged son. Absalom's next step was to advance the pending coup. He went to his father, David, and asked permission to go to Hebron to thank God for the circumstances that led him to return to Jerusalem. That's in verses 7 and 8 of chapter 15. The king saw no problem with his son's request, which turned out to be a mistake. He had planned to go to Hebron not to worship, but to have a base from which to be proclaimed king. Indeed, Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all Israel to let the population know that a change was afoot. As soon as the trumpet sounded, all Israel would realize that Absalom had become king in Hebron. Part of this devious plot involved Absalom's inviting 200 people from Jerusalem to accompany him at Hebron. They suspected not a thing. Presumably, most of these had been employed in one way or another by David. At the same time, Absalom issued a special invitation to Ahithophel, one of David's own advisors. That's in verses 11 and 12 of chapter 15. Absalom was leaving nothing to chance. This was a well-orchestrated attempt to overthrow King David. Incredibly, the plot worked. David was informed that the loyalty of the Israelite population had shifted dramatically. Absalom had successfully wooed the people. They were now in his corner. David thought he had no recourse but to flee Jerusalem. David got out of town as fast as he could. He gathered up his household, a number of servants, and left the city. He left behind 10 of his concubines to take care of the rest of the household. As David escaped, a number of non-Israelites who had served with and for David escaped with him. Absalom's scheme had been successful. The great David had ignominiously been forced out of Jerusalem and his own palace. His own son had accomplished this. David continued to pay 4 times the amount that he thought the rich man in Nathan's little story needed to pay. One wonders whether he thought of his reaction to Nathan's tale as he got out of town as fast as possible. In next week's podcast, we will see that David's 4-fold payment, a self-fulfilling prophecy, is not yet done. Go to my website, faspina.com, which, by the way, is being remade as we speak. Let me know what your email is. The mini courses I've been promising you are going to happen, even though this is now starting to be the kingdom of God already here, but not yet accomplished. But it'll happen, I promise you. And if you have questions for me you want me to answer in a future Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do 2 simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.